Good afternoon, everybody. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this one UN side event on climate-related human mobility. My name is Madeleine Garlick. I'm the Chief of the Protection, Policy and Legal Advice section of the Division of International Protection with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. UNHCR has the pleasure and the privilege to co-host this side event together with IOM, the International Organization for Migration today, and I have the honour to be your moderator. This event, in our view, provides an invaluable opportunity to highlight the UN system's active engagement in the implementation of the mobility-related aspects of the Paris Agreement. We hope that it's going to enable each of the participants in today's panel to share their perspectives and some key priorities on human mobility and climate change based on their respective mandates and thematic expertise. The event, in our view, is particularly timely, given that the work of the Taskforce on Displacement is now underway, and importantly that the process of developing specific recommendations on averting, minimising and addressing displacement in the context of climate change is underway. We're going to hear from each of the experts on our eminent panel today, followed by some time for questions and discussions from the floor. And finally, we'll benefit from some concluding remarks from Mr. Ovais Sarnad, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. But first, I'd like to give the floor to Renate Held, the Director of the Department of Migration Management of IOM, for some further introductory remarks. And I believe we'll have a short video also.
Dear delegates and colleagues, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this event of the UN System on Climate-Related Human Mobility. Since 2015, IOM and UNHCR, within the framework of the One UN System Climate Action, organize an event dedicated to migration and displacement at yearly Conference of Parties in order to bring awareness to the human face of climate change and its impacts on the mobility of people. I would like to make 3 points to set the scene for our discussion today. First of all, let's take note of the fact and acknowledge and rejoice in that the topic of human mobility is now firmly anchored in global climate policy. In 2010, at the Conference of Parties 16 in Cancun, the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change adopted the Cancun Adaptation Framework that for the first time invited all parties to take measures to enhance understanding, coordination, and cooperation on climate-related migration, displacement, and planned relocation. In 2015, in the Paris Agreement, a Conference of Party decision requested the Executive Committee, also referred to as the EXCOM of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, to establish a task force on displacement to develop recommendations to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to adverse impacts of climate change. In addition to the task force, the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism also has a work stream dedicated to migration, displacement, and human mobility in its 5-year regular work program, whose implementation will start next year. Back in 2013, only a few minutes in an official side event at the Conference of Party 20 in Lima were dedicated to migration matters. However, last year in Marrakesh at the COP22, more than 25 events looked at the various dimensions of climate mobility nexus. This year in Bonn, there are 15 events. IOM is pleased to note the institutionalization of the topic of mobility within the global climate negotiations, a once marginalized issue that is now firmly anchored within global climate policy, and this opens great possibilities to work at both policy and programmatic field level to support climate migrants and displaced persons. Secondly, we need to ensure policy coherence with other relevant processes in order to maximize action. At the same time, we see advances in other global policy areas with efforts to take climate-related mobility into account. Greater coherence and collaboration are needed in order to connect the dots avoid duplications, and make the best use of existing limited resources. In particular, IOM believes that we need to connect the work of the ExComm and the Taskforce on Displacement with the negotiations on the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration that are currently ongoing. The Global Compact process offers an unprecedented opportunity to progress in terms of the overall governance and management of international migration and anchor the environmental and climate dimensions in the migration governance agenda. Given worldwide developments, future migration policy has to take into account also climate and environmental factors. It is also important to note that climate and migration concerns are integrated into other global policy processes, such as the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the New Urban Agenda, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the Global Forum on Migration and Development. IOM is engaged in all of these processes, and one of our main aims is to promote a coherent message and ensure synergies on the topic of climate migration. Thirdly, let's remember that time for concrete action is now. Alongside these great advances at the policy level, we also need to focus on the development of programs and projects to support the migrants and displaced people and empower the policymakers and practitioners at the local, national, and regional levels to take actions in this complex issue. Through IOM projects worldwide, as well as through the work of governments, civil society, and the UN system, we have dozens of examples of good practices on how to manage mobility linked to climate impacts. Let's learn from these examples and build upon them to make our action more effective and targeted. We believe that it's crucial to design evidence-based interventions before, during, and after migration. Our speakers today will provide concrete examples and recommendations on how we can act to lessen the negative impacts of climate change on mobility and maximize the potential benefits. The speakers will provide insights from different thematic angles, such as gender, protection, land rehabilitation, agriculture, climate, human rights, labor, and development. Finally, let me share one recommendation from IOM to the Taskforce on Displacement. In light of the immense challenges, we need to support states' capacities to address climate migration holistically and coherently. One concrete way to do this is to implement capacity building workshops at the national and regional levels and encourage policy dialogues, bringing together the many government entities that have a stake in the climate migration nexus, from environment and climate policy makers to those in charge of migrations and borders. We are happy to continue to support such endeavors. IOM has organized capacity building workshops in more than 40 countries with more than 350 policymakers trained on the basis of a training manual available in 4 languages. Let me conclude by renewing IOM's commitment as a member of the Taskforce on Displacement to support the work of the ExComm on the climate and migration nexus. I now pass the floor to my colleague, Madeleine Garlick, who will introduce the video.
Thank you very much. Let the video begin.
I'll speak for itself.
Dans les années 70, avant la sécheresse, Mopti était la région la plus prospère du Mali. Mais avec l'avènement de la sécheresse, avec l'assèchement des fleuves, avec la désertification et autres, les poissons se font rares, les sols sont pauvres. Tant qu'il n'y a pas d'eau, on ne peut pas pêcher. Auparavant, il n'y a que les bozos seulement qui pêchaient. Avec la sécheresse, il n'y a pas assez d'activité. Tout le monde cherche à survivre. Donc, quand il y a un peu de poissons seulement dans l'eau, en plus des bozos, il y a d'autres personnes qui viennent chercher aussi de quoi à manger. il y aura conflit entre Bozo et Dogon ou Peul ou Bamara. Les sols sont pauvres. S'il n'y a pas assez de pluie aussi, on ne peut pas avoir du riz, on ne peut pas faire une très bonne récolte. Il n'y a pas d'herbe. Donc les animaux aussi vont mourir. Les éleveurs sont obligés de chercher là où il y a des herbes. Donc des fois, à la recherche des herbes, ils entrent dans les champs des agriculteurs. Cela va entraîner aussi des problèmes entre agriculteurs et éleveurs. Ce qui veut dire que le changement climatique a entraîné beaucoup de choses. Ça, c'est le cas aussi des cultivateurs, des agriculteurs. Même si la selle s'appauvrit, et ils font tout pour augmenter leur croissance, même si le sol là va mourir, et ils s'en fichent. Donc, dans tous ces cas, les conséquences, c'est nous qui en subissons, or que c'est nous, même les vrais fautifs. Parce que nous voulons toujours augmenter notre production, nous voulons toujours avoir beaucoup, on s'en fiche de préserver l'environnement pour les générations futures. S'il y a épuisement, ça va laisser le champ libre au changement climatique et la pauvreté va augmenter davantage. Il faut qu'on essaye de trouver une solution à notre cause. Comment avoir beaucoup, mais en préservant l'avenir pour la génération future.
Changement de comportement.
Changement de comportement. Je cherche à avoir beaucoup, mais il faut que je ne nuise pas au futur. Quand il y a des problèmes très graves sur le plan économique, cela va entraîner des conséquences sur le plan social. Quand on parle ici, il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont devenus des rebelles ou autres là, parce qu'ils n'ont pas d'activité. Si ce n'était pas les conséquences du changement climatique, ils n'allaient pas accompagner les rebelles là.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this short video really demonstrates very clearly the scale and the seriousness of the challenges that Mali and many other countries are facing. What we have here is a video that's been made as part of a project by photographer Samuel Turpin, supported by the Swiss Development Corporation and IOM. And I think it really underlines to us here some of the very clear factors which are leading people and in many cases forcing people to move. I'd like to explain very briefly the format of our panel today. We're going to ask each of the organisations that are represented here today to speak very briefly in a maximum of 3 minutes and to cover 3 issues. Firstly, to provide one recommendation related to their specific thematic area of expertise that can feed into the recommendations that might be developed by the Taskforce on Displacement. Secondly, I'll ask them very briefly to illustrate that recommendation with a specific example or an illustration of best practice, and showing how this recommendation might work in practice. And then thirdly, to refer very briefly to the visual image that will accompany their presentation and will be on the screen. But before I don my moderator's hat, or perhaps pick up this bell, which I'm going to need to keep us all to time to get through our very filled program today, I want to just provide very briefly a perspective from UNHCR as the UN Refugee Agency on this issue. As many of you know, of course, UNHCR's expertise and starting point for engagement on climate change-related human mobility, including displacement, migration and planned relocation, is protection. For us, therefore, a key focus for the task force's work needs to be ensuring that approaches to avert, to minimise and address climate change are going to be protection-focused and protection-sensitive. UNHCR's experience and information shows us that states do have the capacity and in many cases the tools to ensure that protection needs and considerations can be adequately taken into account in developing and implementing strategies in the climate change displacement area. And we also see that overlooking crucial protection issues can mean that vulnerabilities, exposure to discriminations and to serious rights violations are likely to increase with devastating consequences, in many cases for individuals. Very briefly, to illustrate this with reference to the example of planned relocation. As many of you know, planned relocation is a process of last resort which consists of moving people out of high-risk areas in the face of foreseeable disasters and climate change. It can be a very important tool for states to adapt to climate change by protecting people and avoiding future forced displacement through the taking of proactive measures. Indeed, we've seen such planned relocation processes commence in different parts of the world, from small island developing states, including Fiji, our chair for this conference, to communities in the United States, in Louisiana and Alaska. A protection-sensitive approach to planned relocation would involve, amongst other things, firstly, a thorough consideration of the needs of and the impacts upon affected communities. Secondly, ensuring that affected communities are fully informed, have an opportunity to be consulted and to participate, if they wish, in the design and implementation of planned relocation movements. And thirdly, adopting and ensuring the application in practice of a clear, coherent and comprehensive legal framework that reflects and enshrines human rights principles as the basis for planned relocation activities. In this way, we believe that planned relocation can serve as an extremely important tool which UNFCCC parties could effectively incorporate into their national planning, including national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions, as a part of their climate change adaptation strategies to move people out of harm's way before displacement occurs. UNHCR has worked closely in the past few years, including notably with Georgetown and the Brookings Institute, to develop guidance on planned relocation, which was published in 2014, and more recently joined also by IOM in the production of a toolbox on planned relocation, which provides checklists, analytical tools and other items that we hope will be helpful for states in looking in this issue. We see this as one very concrete way in which climate change and disaster displacement strategies can be implemented in a protection-oriented way. So allow me now to turn to the other UN agencies who will offer their perspectives on the panel today, starting with Rima Al-Azhar, the Senior Natural Resources Officer of FAO. Thank you very much, Rima.
Thank you, Madeline, and thanks to IOM and UNHCR for inviting FAO to be part of this panel. I'd like to take you back to the video that we just saw, because I think this video illustrates very much how agriculture and climate change and migration are come together. And I want to share with you some statistics that agriculture, when I talk about agriculture, I'm talking about crops, livestock, fisheries, and forestry, absorb 26% of the total damage and losses related to climate, caused by climate change. If we take just the impact of droughts, if we remove all the other types of climate-related impacts, this number goes up to 80%. Somalia is one example of, a drought-affected country. Now, what does it mean? As the farmer said in the video, it means that when you have this type of impact on your source of livelihood, it can cause directly people to migrate to find better sources of livelihood, or indirectly it can cause migration. And again, in the video it was mentioned, because it can create conflict. In the video it said, between the herders and the agriculture producers, but it can also cause another type of conflict between also different groups of people over competition over limited natural resources, be it water, grazing land, etc. And indirectly, it also can cause migration because of the loss of livelihoods and the intensification of socioeconomic drivers of migration. Now, having said that, FAO looks at the whole issue from beginning to end, meaning from the land, the origins of where the migrant is leaving, to the country of transit, to the country of destination. So, if we take, for example, the case of Nepal, which is one of the cases that I wanted to share with you, FAO is did a project in Nepal with the people who were left behind in Nepal, because these are in some villages up to 70% of the men are migrating to the Gulf, and so who's left behind are the elderly, the women, the children, and they're more vulnerable, first of all, to other recurrences of climate impacts, but also, even if there isn't another recurrence of the climate event, they're more vulnerable in terms of livelihoods, and also in terms of producing the agriculture. The agriculture activities that they need to have to improve their livelihood. So FAO in Nepal, did a community-driven development project with the villagers that that had a high level of out migration, and different types of agricultural activities were introduced, and they did capacity building with the women who were in these villages in terms of the type of crops, the water conservation, slope management, because as you know, a lot of those villages are on mountains. 30 seconds. Okay, I have 30 seconds left, so maybe I should just jump directly to the recommendation in that case. And you can ask me questions about Nepal, and I was also going to share with you another example of in the Horn of Africa. But in any case, FAO's recommendation is to invest in sustainable agriculture because that is central to the response to climate and migration challenges, as it promotes both adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, and also reduces other root causes of migration, such as rural poverty and food insecurity. Thank you so much. And just a quick publicity, FAO's flagship publication, which is forthcoming this year, is going to be specifically on rural development, agriculture, and migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rima. That's been very concrete. I'd like now to introduce Meredith Byrne of the International Labour Organization.
Great, thank you very much, Madeline, and thank you also to UNHCR and IOM colleagues who have put in a lot of effort to organize this event, and thank you all for coming out. So I think as we've seen in the video, climate change is already eroding possibilities for sustainable livelihoods and employments. And as we know, when there's no employment, people can be driven to leave their homelands in search of better opportunities. Sometimes this involves using irregular pathways for migration, which places people at greater risk of exploitation, both on the journey and then once they're in the country of destination. However, when safe and regular labor migration pathways are available from climate-stressed areas, migrants can facilitate adaptation at home. And they can also help fill labor shortages and help meet genuine labor market needs in the countries of destination. So on behalf of the labor organization, I would put forward to the WIM that national adaptation planning and development planning foster bilateral and regional discussions on the potential for regular labor migration channels to help boost resilience and address loss and damage as a result of climate change, particularly where it can help boost resilience through the generation of remittances, the transfer of knowledge and skills, or the development of networks that can lead to entrepreneurship and new markets. These pathways should facilitate decent work opportunities and be in line with international labor standards and human rights obligations. Labor migration pathways have yet to feature as a prominent element in adaptation planning and represents a largely untapped mechanism in this regard. With the elaboration of free mobility protocols and increased attention to critical labor migration, states are well positioned to promote well-managed, regular, and safe labor migration as adaptation. Pacific Island nations such as Papua New Guinea, Kiribati, and Tuvalu have utilized seasonal labor migration opportunities to address unemployment, improve skills development, and stimulate growth through remittances. The ILO has worked closely with Tuvalu, Papua New Guinea, and other small island developing states to help ensure that they have the tools necessary to protect their workers abroad and access decent work. And that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Meredith. Now we'll turn to the human rights side and invite Mr. Ben Chachta to address us. He serves as the focal point for climate change and the environment at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, and thank you to those who spoke before me about really two critical issues, being food and decent work. These are both very related to the human rights framework. Our recommendation is that the international community should promote human rights policy coherence throughout the migration, disaster risk reduction, and development agenda. And obviously, all migrants are entitled to the enjoyment of their rights, regardless of their migratory status. Therefore, the human rights framework should guide the work of relevant bodies established under the UNFCCC, including in relation to finance, adaptation, and mitigation. And in particular, human rights should form the foundation upon which to develop recommendations in the WIM Taskforce on Displacement and other fora for approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement in the context of climate change. To deliver on the promise of the Paris Agreement, parties should also ensure the full and effective integration of human rights obligations and the guidelines for implementation of the agreement. So what does this mean in practice? What does policy coherence mean? I have one kind of concrete example of an effort to bring greater policy coherence that I want to share with you, and that's related to the work that we've done this year at the office. Human Rights Council Resolution 35/20 explicitly links our work with the negotiations of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration and the WIM Taskforce on Displacement, which sends notice that human rights policy coherence must be a priority for the international community. I think this is a great example of efforts to connect the climate world with the migration and human rights world. And the Council requests that we organize a panel discussion on human rights, climate change, and migration, which took place on 6 October 2017, and that we then submit this summary report of that discussion to the negotiations of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and to the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage under the UNFCCC. I'm happy to inform you that the summary report has been submitted for editing and translation. That's A/HRC/37/35. And the advanced unedited version of that report should be available on our website shortly. We will be, according to the mandate from the Human Rights Council, transmitting the report to the WIM task force, as well as the negotiations of the Global Compact. I also just briefly wanted to share with you that we are working on other avenues of bringing this discussion to multiple fora, and of developing the obligations and norms as they apply in the context of climate-related migration. So we recently held, in collaboration with the Platform on Disaster Displacement, a study on slow onset effects, an expert meeting on the slow onset effects of climate change and human rights protection for cross-border migrants. On the basis of all of this work, we've elaborated a set of key messages on human rights, climate change, and migration. And in closing, I just want to share with you the sort of top-line messages which articulate the critical human rights obligations of states with regards to migration related to the adverse effects of climate change. These are to ensure the dignity, safety, and human rights of migrants in the context of climate change, to reduce the risk of forced migration through climate change mitigation, to reduce climate change risks through adaptation, to protect the rights of people who are in particularly vulnerable situations, to ensure liberty and freedom of movement for all persons, to ensure durable legal status for all those forced to move, and to ensure safeguards in the context of returns, to ensure meaningful and informed participation, to guarantee human rights and relocation, to ensure access to justice for those affected by climate change, and to cooperate internationally in order to protect the rights of migrants. And I don't have too much to say about this picture. They asked me to provide a picture, and this was one that our communications team had associated with an article about the panel discussion I mentioned. And that article is focused on the commentary and experiences of Ray Bentiti, who is one of the panelists at our panel discussion at the Council, a youth activist from Kiribati. And I would encourage you to have a look at the text there, because it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. If we could move on then to Ms. Barbara Bendandi, who comes to us from the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification. Thank you very much, Barbara. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to thank also my colleague that already explained all the effect of drought on human mobility. I just want to give a couple of data to explain the magnitude of this. For example, the area affected by drought has increased since 1970s with more intense and longer drought in wider areas. And IOM did a study according to which 1.6 billion people had been affected by drought, which is twice the number of people, which is 700, that have been affected by storms. So these numbers are always hidden in the official counts and statistics. Normally, the migration in response to drought is temporary, but there is evidence that in the last 30 years, an average of 50 million people per decade migrated permanently out of drought risk zone. In terms of, well, in the last years, in 2017, according to Oxfam, 3.2 million have been displaced since September, and half of them have been displaced by drought. In terms of recommendation to the Taskforce on displacement, we would like to reaffirm that the international community has to take responsibility to minimize displacement by addressing the root causes, and in these root causes, land should have a central role, because as my colleague from FAO explained, is displacing people directly, but also through by causing local conflict. And similar situation cannot be addressed without addressing land issues in terms of land rehabilitation for pasture and job creation, strengthening land rights and tenure systems. And the task force should also take into account that the approach should connect social and ecological resilience approaches, as the initiative that is on the screen, the 3S initiative on sustainability, stability and security in Africa is trying to do. This is an initiative that has been launched in COP22 in Marrakesh by Senegal and Morocco, with the aim of underlying that the issue of stability and security, also including migration, forced migration and displacement, is always linked to sustainability, and this is their African perspective and contribution to the international discussion at the Global Compact and the contribution to the platform on displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. We'll now do a quick changeover, as we don't have enough room for all. I'd now encourage the colleagues from UNDP, from the UN University, from UN Women and WMO to come to the podium. There'll be an opportunity afterwards to put questions to any of the panellists, however. These ones won't escape just because they're sitting in the front row, and you'll be encouraged to put any questions or comments to them also. So, once he's settled, I'd like to invite, first of all, from UNDP, Dr. Pradeep Kurakula-Surya, forgive my pronunciation, who's the head of the Climate Change Adaptation Unit and Global Focal Point for Green Climate Fund Programming. You have the floor, Pradeep. Thank you.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much to IOM and UNHCR for the invitation. The issue, of course, is fundamental to the work of the United Nations Development Programme. The topic certainly has resonated both with our previous administrator and our new one, who recently went on record stating, we cannot wait for scientific certainty when the statistics on human migration due to environmental reasons, such as natural disasters, are already this high. So the time for waiting and observing is over. We have to take action. Certainly, in the context of UNDP's work, we recognize that this is something that cannot be done unless we have some key ingredients. One certainly is partnerships. We're very proud of the work that we're engaged in with UNEP, FAO, ILO, and others around the world to integrate many of these issues into the Sustainable Development Agenda, which fundamentally needs to be done. We are certainly of the view that when it comes to both the temporary and long-term migration issues that we are now seeing increasingly in places such as Kiribati, as you can observe, adaptation to climate change needs to be scaled up across regions that are facing an increased risk of climate-induced hazards, and migration certainly then becomes an inevitable course of action. And it's really in places like Kiribati where this really hits home hardest, although of course the effects are no doubt no less in many other places around the world. The government of Kiribati has certainly recognized that there will be a time when permanent migration it will have to be the reality, and they have already taken steps to address this by purchasing land in places like Fiji and paving the way for the future relocation of their peoples. But that is still not their preferred option, as one could imagine and empathize with. There's a lot that needs to be done now to deal with, to help communities in Kiribati to deal with many of the pressures that they're facing. UNDP certainly has been engaged on the ground with providing support to enhance food security, build up national capacity and community-based island-specific interventions in places like South Tarawa and 3 other outer islands. Projects have been implemented to adopt a whole-of-island approach to resilience building that hopefully will postpone the day where permanent movement and migration has to take place. And presently, we're currently supporting the government to develop a large-scale coastal protection project for financing with the Green Climate Fund. Finally, I want to make the point that these issues need to be underpinned with finance. Unless finance is available, easy to access, and can be programmed quickly, many of these issues will become much more prominent and urgent faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. We'll now turn to Dr. Robert Oakes, who is a senior researcher at the United Nations University's Institute for Environment and Human Security. Robert, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organisers for the invitation. Do we have a slide? No? So my main recommendation is that addressing mobility should focus on facilitating options for how, when, and where to move. And the key point here is the term options, the idea of choice and agency. Because as we know, that when people have some control over when they move, they may not want to move, but when they control when and how and why they move, then we can reduce the losses and damages. When displacements occur, those losses and damages tend to be higher. So this could be in terms of health, access to food and water, livelihoods, the ability to fish or to have some land to work on, land tenure, but also culture. So to have that connection with the place that is your home. Our research in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru suggests that with current trends of urbanization, we could find that these populations and urban centers are going to increase, and actually the losses and damages in these places could get worse. So already in Kiribati, we found that 14% of all movements in the last 10 years were mainly down to environmental factors, but there's also other factors coming into play, like moving for education or work. And what this can mean is that in South Tarawa, the capital, there's already strains on resources, there's always strains on sanitation, on water. And with more and more people coming in, we may well have a more exposed population because of climate change intensifying climate risks, but also a more vulnerable population if livelihoods are affected by climate change impacts, and a bigger population because of natural increases, but also because of flows from outer islands to the central capital islands. So we found that by the middle of the 21st century, there might be 70%, 75% more people actually in these capital islands, placing more stress. So here's the photo. We can see that the kind of mixture of impacts we've got there. We've got the sanitation issue, the litter, the pollution, and the sea level rise all impacting together, meaning these movements into South Tarawa, the sustainability of it is questionable, and in the future that is going to get worse. So what can we say about this? That current and future flows of mobility can result in the intensification of risk when people's options are limited. So if we can give more choice to people about their movements, then these problems can be overcome to an extent. So of course we need to avert and minimize when people don't want to move, good, but we know that people are moving and they'll continue to move, so we need to enable those movements to be done with dignity. So that could be, as suggested earlier, about extending existing arrangements for labour migration, for example, but also encouraging other forms of adaptive migration, which doesn't increase risk. But we also need to accept that some people will not want to move. They might want to move in the future, but not now. So those people need to be able to adapt, and their adaptation needs to be facilitated. And at UNU-EHS, we provide research with governments. We're able to help ExCom to produce some scientific basis, to produce some policy that's going to help with this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. We'll now turn, if we can, to Veronica Lantis, who is an international governmental specialist with UN Women. Thank you, Verona.
Thank you, moderator. When I was writing the introduction of my talk today, I was saying that this is a gender balanced panel, but of course we cut the panels into two, so we're not balanced anymore. But I thank the organizers for of course this panel and also for consistently integrating all the partners, including UN Women, to ensure the integration of the gender perspectives in this discussion. So when I was asked for one recommendation, I submitted related to averting, minimizing, and addressing human mobility related to climate change. What does this mean in concrete terms? We have very limited time, so just another headline message. We know that women and girls are, of course, disproportionately impacted by climate change, and we have figures on that, but we don't have time to discuss that. So what this means is that when we devise policies, devise programs, financing, as mentioned by our UNDP colleague, this must be developed with, from the beginning, a gender lens, a gender hat, a gender perspective, whatever you want to call it. It means tackling the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination against displaced women and girls, providing access to sexual and reproductive health services, combating sexual and gender-based violence, access to justice mentioned earlier, to name a few. But more importantly, and something that we also have to lift aside from the vulnerability angle, is that women are also significantly contributing to solutions, whether in their households, at the local level, communities, and therefore they should also be afforded the voice, their agency, meaningful participation, and not just as recipients. Just to put some 4 bullets to close, the measures must provide for specific and targeted financial resources and other mechanisms that are gender responsive, strengthen gender responsive data collection and analysis, strengthen women's agency, leadership full and equal participation in all decision-making processes, and addressing the rights, needs, opportunities, contributions, and role of women and girl migrants. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Verona. And then we'll come to our last panelist, who will be Mr. Amir Delia, who is the Senior Scientific Coordinator in Climate Prediction and the Adaptation Branch of the World Meteorological Organization. Amir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I would like to thank UNHCR and IOM for inviting WMO to this side event. Communities have always been exposed to climate variability and climate extremes, but the expected increase in frequency and intensity of these events due to a changing climate poses new challenges for societies worldwide. World Meteorological Organization monitors the Earth's climate on a global scale so that reliable information is available to support evidence-based decision-making on how to best adapt to a changing climate and manage risks associated with climate variability and extremes. Reducing the risks and maximizing opportunities of climate impacts require appropriate science-based information and the necessary institutional, infrastructural, and human capacity to transform and communicate this information into complex decision outcomes. It is essential to enable societies to better manage the risks and opportunities arising from climate variability and change. This important will require to enhance climate literacy. This is a best practice I emphasize, to enhance climate literacy among vulnerable communities, decision makers and policymakers, to understand, interpret, and apply climate information within contextually relevant decision-making frameworks. Many countries lack the resources to provide high-quality climate services, particularly in the developing countries and least developed countries. Since 2009, WMO, in collaboration with other UN agencies, has started implementing Global Framework for Climate Services, GFCS. The main focus of the framework is to enable society to better manage the risks and opportunities arising from climate variability and climate change through incorporating climate information and prediction into planning, policy, and practices. Climate information provides quantitative values, thresholds, indices, and toolkits, which are universally agreed around the world to measure and understand better the magnitude and intensity of rapid as well as slow onset weather and climate phenomena. Through monitoring the climate system, we have noticed that rapid onset phenomena mainly damages surface structures, while slow onset phenomena such as sea level rise and long-term droughts leave irreversible impacts on water resources and land productivity. Such natural resources are essential elements for sustaining livelihoods of population, and they act as drivers for migration in vulnerable regions. As recommendation, finally, we believe that integrated interdisciplinary cooperation is essential to put migration and human displacement in the context of evolving climate system. We note that such interfaces are still passive and relatively and need greater emphasis in the future. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much, Amir. Thanks to everybody's discipline, we now have an opportunity for questions and comments from the floor. So I'd like to encourage anybody who's here who would like to put a question to a specific panelist or to various panelists at large to signal that desire. We have a microphone up here, which I believe you can move to in order to put your comments so all can hear. Perhaps I can just encourage all of those who might wish to put a question or make a comment to raise their hands, and we can take a number before we revert to the panel. Who Who's going to go first? Yes, sir.
Hello. Just the last presentation, I would like to try to understand the relationship between what you mentioned, climate literacy, and the need for information and data to understand better present and future changes. It seems to me there is a reciprocal or complicated flow between people that would decide to move or have to move and the need to understand what's going to happen or what's happening in order to plan and of course to open options on how, when, and where. It seems to me it's related.
Could I just invite you, sir, to give us your name and your institution too?
Boris Greisborg, Mexico, El Colegio de México.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll take a few interventions. If I could please invite Mr. Atle Solberg from the Platform on Disaster Displacement to the microphone.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. My name is Atle Solberg. I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement. What we do is to find or to strengthen measures that can better protect people that are displaced in the context of disasters and the adverse effect of climate change. A lot of what we've heard today is what we also promote, measures that can help people stay as long as they want, increase their options to stay, measures that can help people move safely if they so desire, and also measures that can better protect people that are displaced into another country. So in that sense, it's very encouraging to see all the UN agencies addressing different aspects of these challenges related to climate change and human mobility. And this leads me to the question, and I know it's a difficult question, and it's about policy coherence. And we heard the High Commissioner for Human Rights stressing the importance of policy coherence. And it seems to be the mantra also in the climate change negotiation. We learned from, or the panel is a testimony to how cross-cutting the issue is. We need to talk about work, we need to talk about health, we need to talk about data, gender, and so on. And it's also apparently, or it's evidently a strategy of the new Secretary General, policy coherence across the system. But what are then the mechanisms whereby the UN system can get some coherence around climate change and human mobility? And let me just pose two very specific questions on this. For example, within the Global Migration Group, what are the efforts to get the policy coherence together in the system? And what are the plans maybe going to the negotiation on the Global Compact on Migration to get policy coherence on these issues? So that's one question around the migration leadership going forward, both in the Global Migration Group and the Global Compact on Migration. And the second, is there any plans, maybe upstream in the UN system, to go to the Taskforce on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism, so the UN presents or submits its recommendation to the Taskforce? Are there any plans for that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir, we had another intervener from the floor.
Hi, my name is Dane Ratliff from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law at McGill University, and I had the privilege of being at the earlier conference that Atle put on and posed a very similar question. So we're going to be presenting a conference of high-level academicians, legal experts, science and data people at Yale University next year, and we want our work to be practical, not just produce papers with thousands of footnotes, but to practically figure into something like the Global Compact and the Taskforce on Displacement's work, and also the various UN agencies, UNHCR and IOM, et cetera. And we were wondering, what are the main legal issues for strengthening rights and protections that you see, the things that we should be focusing on, helping out with their issues such as the definitional issue of a climate displaced person, categorization of that in international instruments. One of the things that the earlier panel spoke about was a humanitarian visa program. Is there any discussion for how that could be set up? And then general public international law issues such as recognition of states without territory. And so if any of the panelists from the earlier panel or this panel could address those issues, I'd be very happy to hear that, and would also, of course, encourage you to participate in the conference coming up as well next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we'll take one more question perhaps and then invite members of the panel to respond. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tosin Kolawole from Climate Aid Initiative, Lagos. Thank you for the story. The video we watched, it actually highlights the importance of and the impact on climate change driven, on migration in Africa. And my point of discussion is actually on the Nigerian case. That's talking about Lake Chad and its attendant impact on people who live around their community, and also it's actually driving and leading to mass displacements in Nigeria. And you made mention the other time about providing capacity building and also support for farmers. And if you're talking about capacity building, who are actually the people you target? And in Nigeria, the case we have is that there's no policy framework that addresses how such issues is concerned or to be addressed. And some months ago, we actually tried to reach out to IOM in Nigeria because we're trying to see how we can, have a national symposium on climate change-driven migration in Nigeria and its related impact on human, security. But until now, we've not really gotten any, favorable response. And so I'm trying to find out what form of support do you have for local organizations who are working to help to see how we can keep the people in the ground, as in their homes, and reducing the impact and strengthening their resilience to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got some interesting questions there. I think, first of all, for WMO, there was a specific question from Mexico.
Yep. Well, as I mentioned in my statement, WMO provides indices and numbers of major climate parameters, like drought indices, or we provide climate projection that what will happen in near and long-term future. So we also interpret them into impacts in agriculture, food security, water resources, and so on. But when it comes to migration, it's really a multidisciplinary area that all these organizations should sit together to interpret those scientific findings into human displacement, to put them in many other socioeconomic sectors to see how people will react. And situation is completely different from one region to another, from one location to another. So my recommendation is that it's a multidisciplinary area of activity and all together should work. But climate information is part of the puzzle, is a major part of the puzzle that can give us better understanding that what is the direction of climate change and variability. So this is my suggestion and answer to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Ben from OHCHR, if you'd like to.
Are these on? Okay. I was really happy to get off the stage earlier because these lights are like straight in the eye. So I wanted to address the questions posed by the gentleman from McGill and Atley. So OHCHR is working on elaborating a set of principles and guidelines within the context of the Global Migration Group on the protection of migrants in vulnerable situations. And this idea of whether or not we need additional categories or specific status for migrants is one that we would kind of push back on and say what we need is to apply the human rights protection framework to all persons who are migrating and vulnerable to certain risks. And it's difficult, I think, particularly to determine what the exact trigger of movement is, given the many things that cause people to move and factor into their movement. Things like poverty, discrimination, climate change, environmental degradation, etc. So we think what's really important is that we have general principles and guidelines that apply to all persons moving in situations of vulnerability. Another question was about the Global Compact. As I mentioned, we are feeding into that process, the summary report from the panel discussion we had. And that's certainly one way to have policy coherence. And it's actually probably the easiest way is when you have an explicit mandate to link these processes. Because otherwise, a person like me who's a human rights expert comes to climate change negotiations and, believe it or not, does not always receive the warmest welcome and thanks for the inputs we have to make about policy coherence. And I think there's a real problem in terms of socializing the different communities and experts so that they understand these are all agreed norms and standards, and we need to look at this holistically. The 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, the International Human Rights Framework, and see how all of these things fit together and how things like gender equality and human rights underpin everything. I wanted to say one last bit to sort of link to the ongoing negotiations here, that we have a real opportunity to push and promote policy coherence if we link and promote access to information and participation and inclusiveness in the context of the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement. I think it's often outside partners who are the ones that really help push the international system into policy coherence by raising the alarm when actions meant to, let's say, benefit the planet by addressing climate mitigation and adaptation have negative impacts elsewhere on other objectives of the international community, like respecting, promoting, and protecting human rights for all. So I think the negotiations right now are particularly critical. Gender action plans, the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement, the ongoing discussion of the WIM task force. And we welcome any opportunity to feed into those processes and help as part of the UN system to promote better and stronger policy coherence. Thank you, and I'm going to dash away from those lights. Sorry.
Thank you, Ben. Robert, I think you'd also like to speak.
Yes, very briefly on the first question about climate literacy. Yes, definitely, it's really important that we really promote the use of this big data, indices, etc. We use them in our own work. But we have to be very careful that we're combining natural sciences with social sciences, because the big issue I see here is what is risk. You can't just educate someone and say, hey, this situation is risky, you need to act upon that risk. It's a two-way process, as you mentioned, because risk is inherently subjective. So people have different ways of interpreting risk and also different desires about what to do with that interpretation of risk. So very briefly, in our research, when we were looking in the Pacific, trying to find out how people conceptualize climate change, environmental change, and mobility, we found that some people were thinking, no, I don't want to move because I'm worried about what's going to happen to me if I move. So I'm worried about this possible loss and damage which may occur, even if a different loss and damage may occur if I stay. And I found a similar sort of idea when I was looking at hurricane evacuation. People don't want to necessarily evacuate from the United States, from a coastal region, because they think that they need to be at home to protect their house. So there's lots of different ways, and GIS or meteorological organizations give us some information, but that needs to be married together with social sciences to look at how people can and should react to this information.
Thank you. The UN University perspective. Verona from UN Women. Thank you.
Just to address the question on policy coherence, I agree with Alta's point. I mean, it's really helpful to have UN system-wide gathering, even if it's informal, and come up with some key recommendations or positions. The question, I mean, I'm talking about it because of experiences in the climate change. There has been that coherence within the UN system, and it has elevated to a higher level. I mean, I don't want to talk about very technical terms in an audience which is mixed, but I think there has to be a lead agency, and normally the lead agency is the one who is the technical leads on that particular issue. For example, in the case of migration, I would think IOM, but there has to be somebody who's going to lead it, and it has to be consistent also. You have to remember that it's going to be an extra work for the other people in the other agencies, so if there's no push from the lead agency, it's not going to be sustained. But I believe that it's important to have that one UN voice to impact processes like the Global Compact on Migration, the WIM process here.
Thank you. Yes, I'll ask Meredith from ILO, and then we need to hear from our concluding speaker.
Back up to the bright lights. Just quickly, the colleague from McGill, also to build off of what Ben from OHCHR just shared with us, and the application of certain protection mechanisms that apply to all people, regardless of where they live, their displacement, and their status. Also, and sometimes a missed component, is that there are labor standards that apply to all workers and all persons, regardless of their status, whether they're regular or irregular migrants. That means they also apply to refugees when they're employed outside of their own countries, if they're in the informal economy. So there's also a pretty robust labor protection aspect to it as well. Keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you. And Pradeep.
Yeah, just a couple of points. The question on coherence also asked about the mechanisms through which this could happen. Certainly from an institutional perspective, there are various partnerships that are currently at the forefront of trying to bring that coherence together. UNDP, UNFCCC, UNEP are currently working on a climate change policy across the UN system as the climate change core group, working closely together with the SG's office. And while this policy work will touch on many issues, including on conflict and other issues, migration will come up. Now, this is necessary, but in my view, it's not sufficient. There's another layer to this, which is getting coherence as close as possible to the ground. And here, I think the role of the UN country teams is critical as we employ different means, but also bring together different resources, both technical and financial. All of these also need to be aligned to deal with some of the core issues that are emerging in the context of migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I mentioned earlier that we have the privilege of having with us here Mr. Ovais Samad, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. Unfortunately, he has to leave us very shortly, so we'll invite him to come to the microphone and give us some remarks before he needs to depart. We'll then resume the Q&A because we have a little bit more time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see many of you, and especially colleagues from IOM, from where I migrated, actually. I came from IOM to the Climate Change Secretariat 2 months ago, so I'm still very new. Look, this discussion is extremely helpful, relevant, and very, very useful, especially because so many different agencies are coming together, UN agencies, to address this huge issue, huge phenomenon that we are all talking about, climate change. And I've been involved now in following the climate change negotiations of the parties. And the the issue is extremely, extremely complex. Now, what I will, in my remarks, I'm not going to focus so much on what, of which you have the expertise here on the panel, and many of you know what it means, but more focus on how. Now, by that what I mean is you already talked about policy coherence, different agencies working together, but that needs to be scaled up. It is not sufficient because the negotiations that are happening, the parties are negotiating as we speak, they're extremely intense, and you need to, or IOM and other agencies, United Nations as a whole, they need to make sure that they are well coordinated and make sure that their policy perspectives are very well articulated and then brought to the forefront in terms of, now what I mean there, and I've been trying to convey that since I've arrived here, to bring out the human dimension, the human cost, the human aspect of climate change, which is somehow getting diluted in the narrative, in the negotiations. People are focusing more on the process rather than on the actual action that needs to happen. So there, I think UN agencies working across the whole spectrum, they need to come together. In that regard, you already mentioned from UNDP, UNEP, and UNFCCC are working very closely on a policy. But other organizations, other UN organizations to also come into that coalition, if I can characterize that as a coalition. They need to come together, they need to leverage. And very importantly, similar to what happens in IOM, is to operationalize what we are talking about through actual programs, through actual action. And in that regard, in UNFCCC, we are moving towards a very strong perspective on global climate action. And in fact, the bond zone where you're sitting is about that, to actually bring forward good examples, good policies, good practices that are happening all around the world, including private sector, the non-state actors. There is a huge debate that is happening right now, the involvement of non-state actors. So it's only through, and from my experience, it's not through discussions in rooms like this, but through actual action on the ground that we can bring about real change. So that would be my take on this and perspective, and convey to you what is currently happening. So also in more concrete terms, I hope through this discussion, through this dialogue, you can come up with some very clear policy perspective, the high-level takeaways from your discussions in the various organizations, and feed that into those negotiations. And that needs to be done sooner the better. You already mentioned the WIM framework. That is a very good piece in the negotiations, but that's probably not enough. That only addresses one aspect, but it needs to be brought into it. It needs to be mainstream. That is extremely important. So that's what I would like to share with you. And from the UN Climate Change Secretariat, which I represent, once again, welcome to all of you, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here, especially to see so many UN agencies joining together, IOM, HCR, ILO, OHCHR, FAO, desertification, university, UN Women, UNDP, WMO, and possibly others. We need the champions, they already identified champions in that group, UNEP, UNDP, and UNFCCC, to work much more strongly and raise the political ambition to take this forward. So with those remarks, I'd like to once again wish you all the very best and look forward to seeing you in other discussions. Enjoy your time here. Thank you.
All right, I think we do have still time for a few more questions from the floor. I think there's still some members of the panel who might also have some reflections on what we've already been asked so far that hasn't been addressed completely. So please raise your hands if you do wish to speak. Meanwhile, I'll ask Barbara. Okay. Yes, that's right, to take the floor on the previous round of questions.
Yeah. I wanted to take the question of the gentleman from Nigeria, and I want to thank him for mentioning the Lake Chad, which is, for expert of environmental migration, which I see a lot in this room. It's the first image that you see. You cannot not see the Lake Chad shrinking 90 times in 40 years. So it's something that is very well known in this environment. What it needs to be done, it's action. It's not policy framework at this point. And from an encouraging perspective is that at COP 13, UNCCD COP that happened last month in Ordos, we invited the Minister of Nigeria, the Minister of Interior, to make the case about land degradation as key determining factor for displacement, migration, and security issue in the region. And what happened after was that we got 193 parties to agree on a decision on the link between migration and land degradation, which was the first time that an environmental convention made a decision on migration. So it was pretty a big thing. Now what we need is action. And last week, there was a meeting of the group of climate fragility of the G7, where a couple of colleagues were as well, and they decided to work on Lake Chad because this is the place where all the things are happening, degradation, stability, insecurity, and they are all linked to sustainability somehow.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think there's a question over here. If this gentleman would like to take the floor, introduce yourself and your institution. Thank you very much.
Christoph Driesen, German press agency. How many people are actually displaced by climate-related events every year?
I think, Rina, you would like to take that one?
Yes, I can answer this. It's on average around 22 million, let's say, that are displaced. But when we say displaced, and this is the point that I also wanted to make earlier, we're lumping here, migrants in one big group. We have internal displacement, and then we have, international, let's say, when they cross the border. Most of the migrants are internal migrants. So the whole issue of, what was raised by the University of McGill in terms of, their definition is not really applicable in that sense, because most of them stay in their own country, and there's no issue of humanitarian visa, etc. And we have to keep this in mind, that what we're talking about here, the majority are internally displaced, and a lot of them, because as the gentleman from the university, the UN University mentioned, actually people don't want to leave their homes. They want to go back, and a lot of those internally displaced go back, but this all depends, of course, on the severity and the length of the climate event. So we have to, the panel, we didn't have a lot of time to go into really the details, but we have to think of internal displacement, those that stay within the region and have a higher chance of going back to their countries, and those that actually, make it to Europe or to the United States, and these are the ones that get the headlines. You don't read about Lake Chad in the newspaper, you read about the boat people that are coming into Italy. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps if I could also just use the opportunity to add to that further, Rina. I think we also need to bear in mind the statistics, I think, are notoriously difficult to fix in this regard because, of course, people are moving for many complex reasons. And UNHCR, as the UN Refugee Agency, is very conscious that we are seeing many situations today where people are ostensibly fleeing from conflict, persecution, discrimination on a very severe scale. But quite often these phenomena interact very closely with climate change, with disasters, with reduced access to resources. There's a number of situations in the world where we see today people who do fall within the refugee definition, but whose movements clearly are partly affected by or caused by elements linked to climate change. We think, however, it's important, really, as has been said here before, to bear in mind that we have some important legal standards that set down rights which are extremely important to be respected here. And I think what's very noteworthy in our panel today is that we have heard a number of specific concrete recommendations, precisely as we'd ask them to be, which are focused on trying to ensure that movements can be made in a context where there are more choices, where there is more voluntary character around those movements. We're seeking to try and ensure ways in which people can move in safety and dignity and with elements of choice which can ensure that can happen in the most, in a way that exerts least hardship on them and their families. So I think that's really an important focus for all of our work, analysing and looking at ways to address this phenomenon. So I think we have time perhaps for 2 more questions or comments, if that's the case. Pradeep, again.
Just to add on to your point, I think a statistic that you might be interested in, which certainly scares me incredibly, is a World Bank report that's coming out, that's due to come out recently or very soon, which has modeled the likely effects of migration, in years ahead. And if your numbers are correct, and which I believe they are, because these are the numbers that I have seen as well, around 20 million, according to the World Bank projections, by 2050, when my 6-year-old is about, it's about 36 years old, we're looking at 10 times the current rates of migration rates in 30 years' time, roughly. So this is a very significant issue which we need to address today. I think the urgency cannot be more pronounced.
Okay, so perhaps we have room for one more question, a comment. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you very much. Per Biemann, NRC Germany. Just very quickly about the figures. The last figures I've seen are on average between 2008 and 2016, 25.2 million per year, according to our IDMC, International Displacement Monitoring Center.
Okay.
Since it came up a few times, my earlier comment regarding the definition in question wasn't to say we need to define what a climate refugee is. It was more focused on, at least for an international legal instrument, determining some kind of causation around displacement being related to climate change and not other factors. And so, at least from an international legal perspective, it seems that that's going to be one of the most important questions to determine is how can we attribute this to a climate-related event and not other factors.
Okay, well, I think perhaps that is a useful note on which to end, because that highlights the fact that we do, all of us here, I think, in this panel and in the room more broadly, have a great deal of work still to do. Clearly, there's an enormous amount of productive research, programming, projects, activities underway, which are all very positive, but the scale of the challenge before us, I think, indeed can't be underestimated. Ben from OHCHR spoke about the lights that are here on us up the front. Perhaps this symbolises the fact that the spotlight really is on us, I think, as workers and experts in this area, to do more and to find more ways forward in the face of the challenges we face. The discussion was really extremely rich. It's very difficult to sum up, I think, what we have here. I think we have a number of very concrete and specific recommendations to the Taskforce on Displacement, which I hope the Taskforce will be ready to take up, and which all of us who are taking part in its work will have an opportunity to elaborate further. But as I said before, I think it's really important that what we acknowledge, I think, here is that we are seeing a situation of extreme human need in many of the cases of affected communities. As was highlighted in the video, I think this is being felt acutely in a number of regions of the world in ways that are life-threatening. And so everything that can be done using the tools we have, but also, I think, through work on international legal principles and potentially international legal instruments where that's possible and appropriate, in order to deal more effectively with this phenomenon, which in many ways is new and beyond the scope of the tools that we have here today. I'd just like to take the opportunity again once more to thank everybody who has taken part in this event for all of the preparation that's gone into it, but also I think the way in which we've managed to identify a number of key ways forward. I'd like to thank IOM as co-panelist, as co-organiser, but also all of the panellists for coming along, and for all of you participants as well. Should there be interest, I think, in discussing with the individual agencies here any further, or for that matter with the Platform on Disaster Displacement on some of the work that's ongoing, I think we're all here and would be available to speak to you further on that. So with many thanks and wishing all of you a successful conference going forward. Thank you.